Welcome back to IPBC Asia 2014, coming to you from Shanghai. When IPBC Global met in Amsterdam in June, one of the topics of discussion was how to value IP, and in particular, how to place that value onto the balance sheets of companies. Well, our next guest has something to say on the matter. He is with Kenyn Kenyon from New York. He's a partner there, and he concerns himself specifically with how to value intellectual property. John Flock, thank you so much for making the time.
Mark, it's a pleasure to be here with you.
Why is this issue actually so difficult before we get into the how to do it?
It's like some people would say valuing art. The beauty is in the eye of the beholder. There are some objective indicators for how you do it, but any particular patent is unique, and it depends on the buyer and the seller as to what the value is going to be. And nonetheless, for a balance sheet, you have to come up with an accurate number, and it's very difficult to predict what an accurate number is, especially when you're buying multiple patents.
And so is there actually a tangible solution to this problem? Because as you say, if somebody was to offer more or less than whatever you have valued it at, well, you'll just do a mark-to-market adjustment, wouldn't you?
Well, at the time of the acquisition, people have to lay out hard cash to go and buy them. And there has to be justification made, so when a company is doing a valuation for one, what to sell it at, and two, what to buy it for, you have to have these markers, these objective things you could explain as to why you should pay a certain amount. And there might be adjustments later on value, but the moment of the payoff, a number's got to be arrived at.
In the lead up to that, and presumably this is what you're focusing on, you have to have some number, some idea going in. You can't just wait for somebody to come along with the cash, right? You have to put draw a line in the sand and say, I'm going to accept no less than this. So how do you come about, or how do you go about finding where that line in the sand should be?
I think there are many ways of doing it. There's a way that I do it. My background is that I was a criminal prosecutor for 9 years, and I've been doing patent law for 20. So I've been in a lot of negotiations, I've asserted a lot of patents and defended a lot of patents, and I have a sense of how you determine whether or not a patent is of value. So it's from that perspective that clients have come to me and asked me to assist them in their work. So they might do the spreadsheet analysis, but someone has to tell them, if you go to a negotiation, what's this worth, and if the negotiation fails and I go to court, what's it worth? And so you can't predict that with certainty, but out of my experience with some of the companies, they've asked me to work with them to provide some guidance.
Okay, so what are some of the ingredients to the secret sauce then, to figuring out that value?
You know, I think the way of doing it, the formula for doing it, is what everyone does. You know, you have to look at, one is, what are patents like this worth generally in the market? What's the going rate? It's hard to know going rate because in most patents you can't equate one to another. And then there's the issue of what's your particular circumstance. And then ultimately what it comes down to, if you get into a bare knuckles brawl, who's likely to win? And if you lose, what will you have to pay? And so the party with the patents looks at that as a factor, says, well, I think I'm more likely to win than not. If I win, here's what I would get. But I want to give a discount because I don't want to have to fight. And how much of a discount do I give? And from the perspective of the purchaser, there are the flip side is happening. And so someone's got to say, what's it worth if you get into an actual brawl? And that's what I do.
Now, earlier on, you used the phrase that you, based on your experience, you have a real sense of where that value should be. So in view of the fact that this is more art than science, what goes into developing that sense? Is it contemporary circumstances? Patents change in value depending, for example, of where the economy might be, or where the focus or the direction of a particular technology is. Can you just explain a little bit more deeply what that sense is and how that comes about?
Okay. So some of the sense comes from my personal experience of having done this. Part is staying on top of the legal side. There are a lot of changes that have been happening in the law, both in terms of the courts and what Congress has been doing, and I think they're well documented. And there was just a decision which really diminishes the value of a certain kind of important patent in the US and will likely devalue them a great deal and will have a major effect on some of the kind of licensing and purchases that get done. So the other part is just knowing what happens in court. So it depends. When you have just one patent, it seems like an easy task to do, but there are times where you have to value a dozen, 2 dozen, 100, or sometimes there's a portfolio of several thousand to look at. And part of it is not just looking at the patent, you have to know the technology, you have to predict the future of the technology, and it's a rough guess as to what one can do. So in that context, I've worked with Lenovo, for example, on some of its acquisitions, and they have times bought particular sets of patents, such as the Unwired Planet acquisition. I worked with them on that. They just purchased Motorola from Google, and I helped them value the patents on that matter. And then also some other matters which are larger portfolios of several thousand patents.
How do you know whether you're successful in valuing a portfolio?
That's an excellent question. I think it's got to be decided by the client. So with certain clients, I've had them come back repeatedly, so they think whatever I'm doing is successful for what they want. And what I do is really a business service. And so if a client feels I'm providing the right kind of interaction with them, the right information, then I feel I've done a successful job. Whether they buy it or not, it's up to them. That's a business call. So from my side, I just want to make sure that I've looked at all the things that I think are important, that my team understands the business side of things, and that it's really a practical type of endeavor.
Has it ever happened to you where you've valued a portfolio of patents only to see that same portfolio be sold at significantly more than your valuation, or perhaps even significantly less?
That hasn't happened to me, in part because the clients I've worked with have not transacted like the same bundle in another transaction to make that comparison. But I do note that there are valuations I've made in the past, which if I made them today, they would be different because the environment has changed. And so the decision can only be made at the time. You predict the future, and sometimes it goes down a different road than the one you had expected.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's unpredictable. These decisions of the court or the passing of legislation, one can see it's going to happen, but you don't know the certainty of exactly what the US Congress or what's happening in Europe, how they're going to actually manifest it.
Yes, with less and less certainty by the day, it seems. John Flock, thank you so much for joining us here at
Mark, it's a
IPBC
pleasure.
Asia 2014 here in Shanghai.